I'm going to go through the basic process of mastering a sound effect using compression. I have a sound of a piece of metal being dropped, and I trim the beginnings and ends to just really what I want. So I cut off the slate, and I left a little bit here because I think there's just a little bit of anticipatory sound of the dropping before the impact. And then also there's that little ring at the end. So whenever you're cutting effects, trimming them down, you'll want to make sure that you kind of listen, make sure you're getting all the interesting stuff that happens after the initial sound that you want, like the impact. So in mastering this, what we're going to do is we're going to compress it. What compressing is going to do, in a particular sound like this that has a very high peak on the impact and then a lot lower stuff afterwards, compression is a really great way to just kind of push this part down. So that way we could push everything up and we could regain some of this sound that was here. So I'm going to use the Dyne 3 compressor limiter, which is the compressor that comes with all versions of Pro Tools. So it's a great compressor to get to know really well. Let's just look at some of the controls on the compressor. The two primary parameters on a compressor are the threshold, which you can see as I adjust this, and this slider goes up and down, as well as this orange line is going back and forth. And the ratio is the other parameter that lends to the compression part. I'm going to put the ratio all the way down to 1:1, meaning this will not compress at all. And let's take a look at this graph here. You'll notice we have this white line, and this represents the level of the sound. This orange line represents the threshold. Notice as I bring this down, the line is going to move to the left. As I bring it up, it moves to the right. So right now this line is straight. Watch what happens as I bring the ratio up. So remember, the ratio is the amount of compression that's being applied to the signal. Right now it's 1:1, meaning there's no compression. Watch this line as I bring this up. You notice it starts bending. What this is telling us is as the signal, as you're looking in this meter here, passes the threshold, it's going to start pushing the level down. So that's how we're able to just affect this peak of the audio, because we're going to adjust the compressor so only this peak triggers the gain reduction. So as the sound plays, as this part goes through, the gain gets pushed down. As we get to here, where we're below the threshold, the gain reduction is not being done. So we affect just this part. It's kind of like if I took the fader, and as the sound played, I brought it down and I brought it immediately back up after the initial impact. And that's kind of what the compressor is doing in a nutshell. If we look at the ratios, if I bring this all the way up, you notice this gets flatter and flatter, meaning the compression, the amount of level it's being pushed down, is considerable. The other two parameters that I want to talk about are the attack and the release. What these affect is how quickly the compression kicks in and how quickly it releases. We can think of it this way. I have the fader and I'm the compressor. So whenever we exceed the threshold, which is right here, I bring this down. And then as soon as we pass the threshold, I bring it back up again. So the attack determines how quickly I bring this down. A very low amount, it's a very short amount of time, so the fader quickly drops down. A higher amount, right now we're at 14.7 milliseconds, meaning this goes a lot slower in lowering the level. So a little bit of this transient is going to escape. And you'll see sometimes you do that because you want to allow a little bit of the transient back into the sound. Release determines how quickly this would jump back to 0. So right now it's a very quick release. So it jumps right back to 0. As I bring this up, it's going to slow down the release. So right now it's 49.3 milliseconds. So as it's down, it's going to take a little more time to come back up. And what that means is some of the compression is then applied to some of this lower stuff that's after the initial transient. And it essentially shapes the sound. And we'll take a listen to that as we play around with the compressor.